I will tell you about a morning in December 2022 when I walked into the kitchen and saw my daughter, Diane, 41, her straight hair neatly clipped back, dressed in a gray cashmere lounge set from a boutique in Burlington, using a piece of fabric to wipe a spill on the marble floor. I looked at that piece of fabric, and my heart dropped like a stone. It was a fragment of the sage green sweater I had spent 3 months of the summer of 2020 weaving. 400 hours at the loom, my fingers moving in the rhythm I learned from my grandmother when I was 12, a rhythm stored in my muscle memory for 50 years. That sweater used the bird's eye weaving technique, something fewer than 10 people in the entire United States still knew. A technique where each tiny motif, no bigger than a pea, is formed through 72 distinct hand movements, impossible to replicate by machine, and impossible to learn from books because it has never been written down. I had planned to submit that sweater to the National Craft Exhibition in Washington, D.C. in February. "Diane," I said, my voice so flat I barely recognized it as my own, "what are you using to wipe the floor?" My daughter looked up, her expression neutral, the look of someone handling a minor inconvenience and being interrupted by an unnecessary question. "Oh, that pile of knitted stuff in your cardboard box," she said. "You weren't using it anyway, and it was just taking up space. I cut some of the old ones into rags, easier than buying cleaning cloths." I looked toward the corner of the kitchen, the large brown cardboard box, the one where I kept experimental swatches, finished pieces I hadn't yet packaged, and the sage green sweater I thought was still safely inside had been opened. Only a few scraps remained. Most of it had been cut into neat rectangles. "Knitted stuff is really just for poor people anyway, Mom," Diane added, tossing the cloth into the basin and continuing to wipe. "You spend all that time making it and barely sell anything. At least this way it's useful. Knitted stuff is just for poor people." I stood in the kitchen doorway, still holding my morning coffee, steam rising from the cup, and let those words settle in. Not so I would believe them, but so I would understand exactly where I stood and what had just happened. Then I set the coffee down, walked over to the box, and picked up what remained, including the piece Diane was using to wipe the floor, which I gently took back from her without another word, and carried everything into my workspace. I closed the door. I sat down in front of my loom, looked at the pieces of fabric in my hands, the fragment from the sage green sweater, now cut into a rectangle, damp and wrinkled, still held enough of the bird's eye pattern to be visible. Tiny motifs like bird tracks, formed by 72 hand movements I had performed hundreds of thousands of times over my life. No one cares about this anymore. That's what my daughter believed. And over the past several years, I had almost started to believe it too. Almost, but not entirely, because in the drawer of my desk there was a business card. I had picked it up off the floor at an art exhibition in Burlington 4 years earlier, bending down simply because I didn't want it stepped on, slipping it into my pocket out of habit, and then forgetting about it. The name on the card was Olivier Marchetti, a French fashion designer with studios in Paris and New York. I had never called him, never thought I had a reason to. But that morning, holding a damp, wrinkled piece of fabric in my hand, I thought, maybe it's time. My name is Adele Rose Carmichael. I was born on January 9th, 1960, in Burlington, Vermont, a small city nestled between the Green Mountains and the deep blue waters of Lake Champlain, where winters last so long that people have to find something to do indoors if they don't want to go mad from the cold and the dark. My grandmother, Rosalie Thibodeau, was the one who taught me how to weave. She was born in Quebec, Canada, into a French family with a hand-weaving tradition dating back to the 19th century. When she married and moved to Vermont, she brought with her knitting needles and a small loom, and the technique her family had preserved for 4 generations. The bird's eye technique, what she called point d'oiseau in French, was the signature method of the Thibodeau line, created by her great-grandmother around 1870 and never written down, only passed from hand to hand. She began teaching me when I was 12, not through theory or explanation. She didn't explain much. Her English wasn't strong, and she didn't believe many words were necessary. She taught by placing my hands in position, adjusting each finger and letting me feel the rhythm. Écoute tes mains, she would say. Listen to your hands. They know what your head has not yet learned. It took me 3 years to learn bird's eye properly, 3 years of afternoons after school, sitting beside my grandmother in her warm kitchen that always smelled of bread and cinnamon, the soft clicking of needles in the lamplight. By the time I was 15, she said I knew it. No more than that. But I could tell from the way she watched my hands that she meant it. At the time, I didn't know she was giving me something so rare it had no measurable value. I only knew I loved it. The feel of soft yarn between my fingers, the steady rhythm of the loom, the moment when a pattern begins to emerge from what once looked like chaos, as if it had always been waiting to appear. My grandmother passed away when I was 22, in the winter of 1982. I sat beside her in the hospital, holding her thin, calloused hand. Her eyes were dim, but still sharp enough to say what she needed to say. She couldn't speak much then. She only squeezed my hand once and whispered, "Garde les mains actives." Keep your hands moving. I have. For 40 years since, no matter what life brought, my hands have never stopped weaving. I married James Carmichael in 1984, a mathematics teacher who loved precision and disliked disorder, and the only person I knew who could sit beside me in silence for hours without feeling the need to speak. We had 2 children, Diane, born in 1981. She was actually James's daughter from a previous marriage, but I took her as my own when she was 7, and Thomas, born in 1988. James died of a stroke in 2016. Thomas now lives in Oregon, and I live alone with my loom in a small wooden house outside Burlington. I taught weaving at a community arts center from 2002 to 2019, when it closed due to lack of funding. In those 17 years, I taught more than 300 students, men, women, children, retirees, people with disabilities seeking craft as therapy. I did not teach bird's eye to most of them, not because I wanted to keep it to myself, but because the technique is too complex and requires years to master. I taught them the fundamentals and intermediate skills, enough for them to continue on their own. I taught bird's eye to only 3 people, and of those 3, only one, Eleanor Park, a 28-year-old Korean-American woman who studied with me in 2014, reached a level I would call mastery. After the art center closed, I continued weaving at home. Not because I had a large market, I didn't, The sweaters and scarves I made were sold at local craft fairs in the summer and on my small Etsy shop. The income covered yarn and tools and added a modest supplement to my retirement. No one in my family really understood why I kept going. Diane was more direct in her lack of understanding. Thomas was quieter, but no more engaged. But I continued, not for money, not for recognition. I continued because my grandmother said, "Garde les mains actives," and because every time I sat at the loom and let my hands move in the rhythm of bird's eye, I felt as if she were still sitting beside me in that warm kitchen that smelled of bread and cinnamon. That is what my daughter calls knitted stuff for poor people. And that is what, on a morning in December 2022, was used to wipe the kitchen floor. Diane was not a bad person. I need to say that first because this story can easily be simplified into a good mother and a bad daughter, and reality is never that simple. Diane grew up in a household where her mother, me, spent many hours each day at the loom and less time on the things she believed mattered: money, status, and success measured in clear numbers. Diane studied business at the University of Vermont, graduated in 2003, and built a career in financial consulting. She was successful by the standards she chose: a beautiful home in downtown Burlington, a gray BMW, clothes from brands featured in fashion magazines. She married and later divorced, had no children, and lived by the belief that something valuable must carry a high price to prove its worth. That belief wasn't wrong. But it created a distance between her and me that no conversation over many years could bridge. We lived together after James passed away. Diane suggested moving in to take care of Mom more easily, and I agreed because I was in the deepest stage of my grief and didn't have the strength to live alone in a house full of James's memories. In some sense, that was my mistake, not because Diane didn't care for me, but because we saw the world too differently to share the same space without gradually colliding. The collisions came slowly. At first, they were offhand remarks about my workspace. "This room is too cramped. Maybe you should put the loom in storage." Then questions about why I didn't use a machine instead of weaving by hand. Machines are much faster and produce more. Then more direct comments about the market. No one buys handmade crafts anymore. How much have you even made selling online all these years? I didn't argue, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood that arguing about fundamentally different values is like arguing whether music is more important than mathematics or the other way around. True for one person, false for another, and no one wins. But then came that December morning. I stood in my workspace with the remaining scraps of fabric in my hands, and for the first time in many years I chose not to be silent. Not out of anger. I had long passed the stage of wanting to shout, but because something had become so clear, it could no longer be ignored. I had been silent for too long, and my silence had been mistaken for agreement. I looked at the damp, crumpled piece of cloth in my hands, looked at the bird's eye pattern still visible on it, despite being cut and wrinkled, and I thought of my grandmother, Rosalie Thibodeau, who crossed the Canadian border carrying her knitting needles and 4 generations of technique, the one who placed my hands into the work and taught me to listen, the one who said, "Garde les mains actives." I set the fabric down, pulled open my desk drawer and searched for the business card. It took 15 minutes of digging through the clutter. But I found it, a small cream-colored card with refined black lettering. Olivier Marchetti, Creative Director, Marchetti Atelier, on Paris and New York. I looked at the card for a moment, then at the fabric in my hand, then at the loom standing in the corner of the room, blue yarn still threaded from the week before. I placed the card on the table, sat down at the loom, and began to weave. Not because I knew what would happen, but because it was the only thing I knew to do when the world stopped making sense. Let my hands move and let clarity come on its own. The story of how Olivier Marchetti found me is more complicated than what I told Diane, and I will tell it fully here, because it is the most important piece for you to understand why everything unfolded the way it did. Olivier Marchetti did not call me because I called him first. He called me. It began with Eleanor Park, one of 3 students I taught the bird's eye technique. After studying with me since 2014, Eleanor continued weaving and developed her own craft career. In 2021, she was invited to participate in an international craft exhibition in New York, the Slow Craft Summit, where she brought several pieces using the bird's eye technique I had taught her. Olivier Marchetti attended that exhibition. He knew a great deal about textiles and weaving techniques, not as a weaver, but as a fashion designer who had worked with hundreds of fabrics from around the world over 30 years. When he saw Eleanor's pieces, he immediately recognized that there was something special in the pattern. He asked her what the technique was called. Eleanor said, "Bird's eye stitch, taught by my instructor, Mrs. Adele Carmichael in Burlington, Vermont." He wrote down my name. But he didn't reach out right away. He was busy with his spring/summer 2022 collection and didn't have time to pursue every interesting thing he encountered. Then came November 2022, 1 month before that morning in the kitchen. Olivier was in New York and stopped by a weekend craft market in Brooklyn. A vendor was packing up their stall, throwing unsold items into a bin to take away. For among them was a small piece of pale blue fabric, the vendor described as a sample, not complete. Olivier looked at that piece of fabric and stopped. "Where did this come from?" he asked. The vendor, a young woman volunteering to help an older craft seller pack up, looked puzzled. "I don't know. It was in this pile. I don't know the seller." Olivier bought the piece of fabric for $5, the vendor surprised that anyone would buy such a small sample, and took it back to his hotel. He examined it under a magnifying glass, took photos, did his research, and realized it was the bird's eye stitch technique he had heard Eleanor Park mention, but executed at a far more refined level than anything Eleanor could produce. This was the work of a master, not a student. He got my phone number through Eleanor Park, and he called on December 22nd, 2022, 10 days after that morning in the kitchen, when I was still sitting at the loom every day, wondering whether I should call him. The phone rang at 3 in the afternoon. An unfamiliar number, a New York area code. I answered. "Mrs. Carmichael?" A man's voice, English with a slight French accent. "My name is Olivier Marchetti. I believe you don't know me, but I've known of your work for some time." He paused for a second. "I'd like to ask you a question. Do you still weave using the bird's eye technique? And if so, would you be open to talking?" I sat in silence for a moment, looked out the window of my workspace, where Vermont snow was falling lightly in the fading afternoon light. Then I said, "I still weave, and I'd like to talk." 3 days later, son Olivier Marchetti flew from New York to Burlington. We met in my workspace. He sat across from me on the chair James used to sit in to read, and I sat at the loom out of habit. He didn't speak much at first. He watched me weave in silence for about 20 minutes, his blue eyes following every movement of my hands. Then he spoke in French, then translated himself when he realized, "I'm sorry. I think in French when I see something truly beautiful. What I meant to say is, I have never seen anyone execute this technique at this level. Who did you learn from?" "My grandmother," I said. "She was from Quebec." He nodded slowly. "I thought so. This technique comes from French-Canadian weaving traditions. I've seen it described in an archive in Montreal, but never actually seen it performed. And I thought it had completely disappeared." "Almost," I said. "There may be a few who still know it, but not many." Olivier Marchetti looked at me for a moment, then said, "Mrs. Carmichael, I'd like to make you an offer. But before I do, I need you to understand that I'm not here to buy a product. I'm here because I believe what you know, this technique, is something the fashion world has been searching for without knowing it exists. And I want to ask whether you'd like to let the world see it." Olivier Marchetti was a 62-year-old man with salt and pepper hair and remarkable hands, the hands of someone accustomed to handling fabric, to assessing quality by touch, feeling surfaces with his fingertips without the need for measurement. He founded Marchetti Atelier in Paris in 1991 after 20 years working for major fashion houses, and over the next 30 years built his own brand around a philosophy he called luxury sustainability. Fashion created from traditional materials and techniques, produced in limited quantities, not mass manufactured. That philosophy wasn't marketing. He had lived by it long before it became a trend. And in recent years, as the sustainable fashion movement gained attention among younger audiences and the media, Marchetti Atelier became one of the most talked about brands. As he explained to me that he was preparing his spring/summer 2024 collection, a collection he wanted to call Mémoire des Mains, Memory of the Hands. The theme was traditional craft techniques at risk of disappearing, brought into high fashion to both preserve and honor them. He had worked with artisans from Japan, Morocco, Peru, and Bolivia. But one crucial link was still missing, a technique representative of North America. "Mrs. Carmichael," he said, "your bird's eye technique is that missing link." His proposal was clear and specific. I would hand weave a number of fabric pieces using the bird's eye technique, around 12 to 15 pieces, each about 1 square meter, for Marchetti Atelier to use as materials in selected designs for the spring-summer collection. My name and the story of the technique would be fully credited in all collection materials, not as an anonymous supplier, but as the keeper of a craft heritage. I would be invited to attend the collection's presentation in Paris in February 2024, and I would be compensated at a level that reflected the true value of the work. He named the number. I listened, and it took a moment to believe I had heard correctly. $18,000 for 12 pieces of fabric, plus all travel and accommodation expenses in Paris. $18,000, equal to my total income from fabric sales over the past 3 years. I didn't answer immediately. I asked him to give me a week to think. He agreed, left his phone number and email, and flew back to New York. That week, I wove. Not to complete anything, I wove to think. And the familiar rhythm of the loom helped me sort through the tangle in my mind. I thought about my grandmother, about the technique she had passed down to me, about how it could disappear if I did nothing, about how Mr. Marchetti was not just offering to buy my work, but offering to bring its story to the world. I also thought about Diane and realized this. I didn't need Diane's approval. I never had. I had only behaved as if I did. On the 7th day, I called Olivier Marchetti and said yes. We signed the contract in early January 2023. I began weaving right after the new year, sitting at the loom from 7 in the morning to 6 in the evening every day, my hands moving in the rhythm of the bird's eye pattern that, after 50 years, had become instinct. I didn't tell Diane, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want her skepticism to affect my energy while I was doing something important. Olivier sent yarn from suppliers he had selected, merino wool from a small farm in Vermont, alpaca from Peru, cashmere from a small producer in Scotland. These yarns were different from what I usually used, higher quality, softer, with colors blended according to a palette he had designed. Weaving with them was a different experience, like playing on a Steinway piano after years on an old instrument. My technique didn't change, but the results became more beautiful in a way I hadn't expected. 8 months later, in August 2023, I completed the final piece of the 12. Olivier came to Burlington a second time to collect them. He laid each piece out on the floor of my workspace, stood looking, and then knelt down to examine them more closely, in silence for about 5 minutes. Then he stood and said, this time in French first, without translating, "C'est magnifique," magnificent. Then he added in English, looking straight into my eyes, "Mrs. Carmichael, this collection will be presented at Paris Fashion Week in February, and your name will appear on all promotional materials. I want you to know that." I nodded, and for the first time in many years, I felt something warm and steady in my chest. Not pride, not triumph, just the feeling of someone who knows they have done the right thing at the right time. Diane found out in October 2023 when Marchetti Atelier's Mémoire des Mains collection began appearing in previews across fashion media, articles and social posts highlighting the artisans behind the collection. One of them featured me, Adele Carmichael, keeper of a 150-year-old bird's eye weaving technique from the French-Canadian tradition, Burlington, Vermont. The article included a photo of me at my loom. Olivier had hired a photographer during his second visit to Burlington, and close-up shots of the bird's eye pattern in the fabric. It ran on Vogue's website and was shared by several major fashion accounts on Instagram. Diane came into my workspace with her phone in hand, the article open on the screen. Her face, for the first time in many years, didn't carry its usual controlled confidence. There was something more complex there, harder to read. "Mom," she said, "is this real? Marchetti? Paris?" "Yes," I said, continuing to weave without looking up. She stood still for a moment. Then she sat down in the chair across from me, the first time I had seen her sit in that room not to tidy up, clear things out, or suggest I get rid of something. She sat and watched me weave in silence for about 3 minutes. I wasn't sure whether she was really watching or just processing. Then she said, "Can I help you? Marketing, PR, brand connections, social media management. I have experience in that field. If Marchetti is using your name, there are a lot of opportunities we could leverage here." I set the needle down, looked at her. In her eyes, I saw something I recognized as genuine interest, not in my work itself, but in the business opportunities my work could create. She saw money, branding, potential, and she wanted in. That wasn't something I judged. It was simply how she saw the world. But it wasn't what I needed. "Diane," I said, my voice as calm and clear as I could make it. "Do you remember that sage green sweater I made in the summer of 2020? She looked at me. I could see that she remembered. "You used it as a rag," I said, "and you said knitted clothes were for poor people." I paused for a second. "The fabrics Marchetti is using in the spring/summer collection are made with the same technique as that sweater. In fact, the technique in these pieces is far more refined." Diane said nothing. I continued. "You didn't do anything wrong in wanting to help me," I said. "But I need you to understand this. What I've built over 50 years, this technique, this story, is not a business opportunity. It's the legacy of my grandmother, Rosalie. And I'm the one who decides how that legacy is used, with whom, and for what purpose." "Don't you need professional management?" she asked, her voice softer now. "I have Olivier Marchetti," I said, "and I have Helen Garcia." Helen was the agent Olivier introduced me to, a woman specializing in artisan rights with an office in New York. "I signed contracts with them before you knew about any of this. Everything is already in place." Diane looked at me for another moment. Then she stood up and walked out. She didn't say anything else. I heard her bedroom door close. I looked at the loom, picked up the needle, and kept going. A few weeks later, Diane spoke to me again, this time with a more concrete proposal. She wanted to start a company under my name, producing and selling fashion items inspired by my weaving technique. She already had a detailed business plan, potential investors, and manufacturing partners. The company would be called Carmichael Craft Company. "You would be the founder and brand ambassador," she explained, energetic and professional. "I'd handle all the business and operations." I listened. Then I said no. Just that one word. No explanation needed, because one word was enough. Diane looked at me in disbelief. "Why not? This is a huge opportunity." "Because your product is not my product," I said. "I weave by hand, piece by piece, using the technique my grandmother gave me. You want to build a company producing items inspired by that technique, but not made with that technique, right? You want to use machines or have others produce something in a similar style. That's not my work, and I won't allow my name to be attached to something that isn't my work." She was silent. "If you want to learn to weave," I said, "I will teach you. Not for business opportunity, but because it was given to me by my grandmother, and I pass it on to those who truly want to learn. But a company in my name selling products made by others, that will not happen." Diane left the room, and this time I knew something between us had changed. Not broken, not ended, but like a boundary that had finally been drawn clearly. I didn't know how she felt about it. I only knew that for the first time in many years, I knew how I felt. Lighter and clear. I arrived in Paris for the first time in my life on February 8th, 2024, at 63 years old, with a small suitcase and hands that had been weaving for over 50 years. Olivier met me at Charles de Gaulle Airport and took me to the hotel, a small but elegant place in the Marais district, an area he said held some of the oldest history in Paris, and where artisans and craftsmen had lived and worked since the 16th century. My room had a window overlooking a narrow cobblestone street, lined with pale yellow limestone buildings and heavy wooden doors. On my first morning, I opened the window and sat there with my coffee, looking out, and felt something I didn't quite have a name for, a strange kind of peace, as if I were sitting exactly where I was meant to be, even though I had never known this place existed. The Mémoire des Mains show took place on the evening of February 15th at the Palais de Tokyo, one of the most important contemporary art museums in Paris. The space inside was vast, with high ceilings and carefully designed lighting, and Olivier chose to present the collection as an installation rather than a traditional runway. Models stood in individual spaces, each surrounded by panels explaining the artisan and technique behind the design. My section was the third from the entrance. The model wore a long sage green coat, the same color as the sweater Diane had cut into rags, made from the fabric I had woven, tailored with Olivier's design details. Beside the model was a panel, bird's eye stitch, hand-weaving technique of the Thibodeau family, Quebec, Canada, 19th century, preserved by Adele Rose Carmichael, Burlington, Vermont, entirely hand-executed, 400 hours per piece. I stood beside that space throughout the evening, not as a spectator, but at Olivier's request, as part of the installation, the artisan beside her work. I brought a small loom and wove in silence for the full 2 hours of the show, so visitors could see the technique being performed in real time. People lingered at my section longer than at others. I heard them speaking in French, English, Japanese, and languages I didn't recognize. Many took photos, not selfies, but of my hands as they worked. Some asked questions, which I answered through a translator Olivier had arranged. An older French woman stepped closer, watched my hands, and said something softly, her voice emotional. The translator said, "She says she sees her grandmother in the way you weave." That was the moment I had to stop weaving for a second and look down. Not out of sadness, but because my grandmother Rosalie, the one who crossed the Canadian border with her needles and 4 generations of technique, was there in that room in Paris, in my hands, and in the eyes of that older French woman watching me. That evening, after the show, Olivier invited me and the other artisans to dinner at a small restaurant near his atelier in Belleville. We ate and talked for 3 hours, and I listened to the stories of weavers from Japan, dyers from Morocco, embroiderers from Peru, all with similar stories, techniques passed down through generations, time that couldn't be measured, and the constant question of whether anyone still cared. After dinner, Olivier sat beside me and said, "The collection will be presented in New York in April, and I've received requests from 3 museums, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Smithsonian, and the Musée des Arts Décoratifs here, for long-term exhibitions on the craft techniques in this collection. I want to ask you, would you be willing to do demonstration workshops for the bird's eye technique? Not to teach it in depth, but to let people see that it exists." I thought of my grandmother, of what she used to say, "Écoute tes mains," listen to your hands. Yes, I said, I would. Media coverage began that very night and continued for weeks. Vogue Paris, Le Monde, the New York Times style section, The Guardian, all ran stories about Mémoire des Mains and the artisans behind it. And the article about me in the New York Times was titled, "The Vermont Weaver Who Kept Alive a 150-Year-Old Stitch." It was widely shared, and the email address listed in the article began receiving messages from strangers. Weaving students wanting to learn, heritage researchers requesting interviews, people working on preservation projects seeking collaboration. Among them was a special email from Eleanor Park, my student since 2014. She wrote, "Mrs. Carmichael, I am so proud, and I want to apologize for not telling you sooner how much the technique you taught me has changed my life." I read that email twice, then set my phone down and looked out the hotel window in Paris, where the warm yellow streetlights illuminated the old stones of the Marais. I thought, Grandmother Rosalie, can you hear this? I returned to Burlington on February 21st, 2024, 1 week after the Paris show. The Burlington airport was small and familiar, the Vermont air cold and clear, carrying the scent of snow and pine. I stepped out, breathed it in, and felt that I was back where I belonged. Diane picked me up at the airport. We sat in the car for a moment without speaking. Then she said, eyes fixed straight ahead, her voice quieter than usual, "I'm sorry about the sweater." I sat still, looking out the window as the white fields of Vermont passed by. "I was wrong to say knitted clothes are only for poor people," she continued. Her voice tightened slightly, not with anger, but because saying this was harder for her than most things. I didn't understand its value. I had no excuse not to. I turned to look at her. Her face, the face I had watched since she was 7 years old, standing at our door with a small backpack, held an expression I wasn't used to seeing there, vulnerability. "Thank you," I said. "That means something to me." We didn't say much more on the drive home. There wasn't anything more that needed to be said at that moment, but the distance between us, the one that had existed for years, felt a little smaller, not gone, just smaller, and that was enough to begin with. The months that followed unfolded in ways I couldn't have fully predicted. The demonstration workshop at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York took place in April 2024. I sat at a loom in a small room inside the museum, and more than 200 people came over 3 days. They didn't come to learn weaving, only to watch, to ask questions, and to hear me talk about my grandmother Rosalie, about the bird's eye technique, about why things made by hand take time, and why that time is part of their value. The Smithsonian Institution raised the possibility of archiving the bird's eye technique, a detailed instructional manual with step-by-step images, notarized and preserved as part of the United States' intangible cultural heritage. I agreed on the condition that the archive would belong to the public, not to any company or commercial organization. Eleanor Park flew from Seattle to Burlington in May to see me. We sat in my workspace and wove together in silence for an afternoon, just like those afternoons 10 years ago, when she was still my student. After that, we had tea and talked into the evening. Eleanor was now teaching weaving at an art school in Seattle and wanted to start a program to preserve traditional weaving techniques. She asked if I wanted to be involved. I said yes. Marchetti Atelier signed a long-term agreement with me, not to make me an employee or a regular supplier, but as an artist in residence, a collaborating artisan, for future collections. Each year, a number of pieces on a schedule I choose, with themes I propose. Olivier called it a collaboration with respect, and I accepted because that was exactly what it was. As for Diane, she no longer lived with me after March, not because we argued or parted badly, but because she chose to rent her own apartment, saying it was time for her to have her space and for me to have mine. I think it was the right decision for both of us. We meet on weekends sometimes, dinner, walks along Lake Champlain in the spring, and those meetings feel lighter when we don't have to share the same space. She asked me once if I could teach her to weave. I said I could if she was willing to start from the beginning and be patient. She said she would think about it. I accepted that answer and didn't ask again. Some things can't be resolved quickly, and trying to resolve them too quickly often damages them more than it heals. I know that from weaving. If you pull the thread too tight, it breaks. If you pull with the right tension, it forms a beautiful pattern. This morning I sat at the loom at 7, as I do every morning. September in Vermont, outside the window, the maple trees have begun to change color, green to yellow to orange to red, the annual cycle I've seen enough times to no longer find surprising, but still find beautiful. I'm weaving a new piece, not for Marchetti this time, but for the Smithsonian, a sample fabric to fully illustrate the bird's eye technique for the archival manual. Each stage of the technique is worked into a different section of the fabric, with yarn colors chosen to create enough contrast for documentation photographs. This is different work from what I usually do, work meant for teaching, not for creating. And in it, I find something meaningful. I am teaching something that has no life, cannot learn, but will hold the lesson longer than any student. People often ask me now, journalists, researchers, weaving students, questions about my success. They use that word as if there were a single moment when everything changed, one day when I went from failure to success. I don't know how to answer that the way they expect, because I don't think life works like that. I didn't become something different in February 2024 when I stood in the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. I am still Adele Rose Carmichael, a weaver from Burlington, Vermont. What changed was not me, but that the outside world finally saw what I had always been. And this is what I want to say about that. The outside world doesn't always see right away. Sometimes it takes 50 years. Sometimes it takes someone like Olivier Marchetti looking at an old scrap of fabric and recognizing what others overlooked. Sometimes it takes someone like Diane, not through her acceptance, but through my refusal to seek it, to push me out of waiting for recognition and into action. As for Diane and me, I don't want to end this story in a way that makes it sound simpler than it is. We are still learning how to be mother and daughter after years of living side by side without truly understanding each other. It is a slow process without a clear timeline, and I don't know where it will end. But I believe in the process because I have learned to trust slow things through weaving. In weaving, there is something beginners often don't understand. What you are weaving doesn't appear right away. You have to work through many rows, many layers, before the pattern begins to form. And during that time, You have to trust the rhythm and the technique you've learned, not constantly checking, not constantly adjusting based on what you see in each individual row. You have to trust the whole. Life is the same. You cannot see the pattern while you are in the middle of weaving it. You can only continue with the right technique, the right rhythm, with your hands in motion. My grandmother used to say, "Garde les mains actives." Keep your hands active. I have. For 50 years, through good days and bad, through loss and doubt and moments when others said what I did had no value, I kept my hands moving, not because I knew everything would turn out fine, but because it was what I knew how to do, and what you know how to do when done with respect and patience finds its own meaning. I am 63, and my hands weave better now than they did at 40, not because they are unscarred or still young, but because they know more, the knowledge that comes from time, from repetition, from everything that has passed. This morning, September sunlight filters through the window, falling across the loom, and the strands of blue and yellow and brown yarn crossing beneath my hands begin to reveal a pattern. Small, steady bird's eye marks, one point at a time, the technique my grandmother learned from her mother and her mother from hers, and that I learned from her calloused hands in a kitchen that smelled of bread and cinnamon. I look at those patterns and hear my grandmother, and I keep weaving.